Hi guys! In this video, we're going to check out how to make an Ableton Live template that you can use every time you make a mashup. I'll start with an example. If you've got a gig coming up on the weekend and you've got 10 new tracks that you want to incorporate into mashups, and for each one of them, you're going to have to start a new session, create a certain amount of audio tracks, set up filtering and EQ on each audio track, as well as limiter effects for the master track. There's a fair bit of repetition just in that one batch of mashups. You're going to be making things a lot easier for yourself if you just come up with a mashup template where you can pretty much do all of those repetitive tasks just once and then never have to worry about them again. A lot of the time, these tasks are simple, annoying little things that just get in the way of your creative decisions, so you might as well get them out of the way first. That's where a template comes in. We can do this now. Begin by opening Ableton Live and starting a new session. If you haven't changed the default session from the one that Live gives you, you'll usually be looking at something like this, a simple session with an audio track and an instrument track. Start off by deleting all the tracks except a single audio track. If there isn't an audio track, create one by going up to Create and clicking Insert Audio Track. Otherwise, just use the keyboard shortcut Ctrl-T on Windows or Command-T on Mac. Next, we want to set up an audio track with two devices that we'll be using on pretty much everything. Firstly, an equalizer, also called an EQ, which helps us control the bass level coming out of the track. And secondly, a filter. Let's go ahead and create these now. The device you use is actually very important. Whether you use an EQ that comes bundled with Live or a third-party plugin, the choice you make about which one you use is extremely important. For instance, Live's own EQ3 device has an incredibly easy interface to use, but it actually creates resonances which boost certain frequencies by tiny amounts, even when the gain settings are at 0. You need an EQ that is completely transparent, that is, there's no change in the audio when all of the gain values are set at 0. This is because most of the time, you don't actually want your elements to be affected by it at all. Fortunately, Live's EQ8, which you would have seen briefly in the last video, does the job quite well. We can test this out by dragging an EQ8 onto a channel that we're playing some audio through. You'll notice that if you don't change anything, the audio sounds exactly the same. And we can tell that there are no resonances because there are no clips at the level meter. If you're into music production and you already have some high-quality parametric EQs, I suggest you use one of those since you'll know them quite well. Because we're not using EQ to shape sounds for tone, simply to balance and remove certain parts of the sound, choose transparency and accuracy over character. Don't use any analog emulations. The main duty of this EQ will be to remove the bass frequencies of the audio passing through it, although we can use it for other functions as well if they come up. We want to create a low band of audio that can be basically turned up and down as if it was a volume knob. If you're used to DJing on a mixing console that has a bass, mid, and treble knob, you'll understand this concept quite well, because all we're really trying to do here is replicate the control that we have over that bass shelf. To do this, pick the lowest EQ band and change it to a low shelf setting. To begin with, set the gain to 0 dB. By default, we don't want this EQ to actually make any changes to the audio coming through it until we ask it to. Set the frequency to around 350 Hz with a nice broad Q of 0.7. If your EQ's Q setting doesn't go this low, just set it as low as you can. The Q setting, which is sometimes known on other EQs as the resonance setting, controls how sudden the change in frequency drop will be around that frequency. Setting it to a nice low level will make it less noticeable for the ear to pick up what's going on, which is good because this effect is something that we want to keep very subtle. Later on, when you automate the gain of this band on your EQ to drop down in volume, all frequencies below 350 will be reduced evenly and smoothly. During a live DJ set, you would generally ride the bass levels on the mixer as you're transitioning between one song and the next. Because mashups basically do this all the time, we need to apply the same theory. Having this bass control already set up on the EQ saves you doing it every single time you start a new mashup. next most common requirement for our audio track will be a filter. High-pass filters are the most useful device in a transition because when a track is being filtered out like this, the intensity of the music is kept almost all the way till the end as it's carried by the high frequencies. However, the power, the warmth, and the presence of the music, carried more by the bottom end, is slowly removed from the audio. This makes it a very effective technique for transferring the responsibilities of the musical tonality, the emotion, and the rhythm from one piece of music to the other. Because the ear perceives it as a movement that goes from low to high pitch, it also perceives it as a build in excitement, even though more and more information in the music is being slowly filtered away. This makes it great for keeping the momentum up in DJ sets. There are a couple of different options for this. Generally, you can use a high-quality EQ to do this, though some plugins are built specifically for the task of filtering. A great filter worth checking out is DJM Filter by Xfer. If you've played live using Pioneer's DJ mixing consoles, DJM Filter emulates the high-pass, low-pass filter you find on the mixer. Because you want filtering to be much more noticeable than the bass changes, this is actually one situation where it's okay to pick whichever device sounds the coolest. Place your filter after the EQ in the device chain and start with its frequency set to the lowest value. Set the filter to the high-pass setting, which on most devices looks something like this, an icon of a sloping hill with the roll-off to the left side. If you'd like to use something that's built in with Live, the auto filter device is pretty awesome. Drag one of those onto the track now and set the Q or resonance to about 1. As you get more confident with filters, you can start to up the resonance value a little bit and make it more noticeable to the ear. How noticeable your filter effects are should also depend on the style of music that you're working with. For now, this setting is a pretty safe balance between being subtle enough and overt enough. One more thing, and this is super important. Set the plugin to the off position. The nature of filter settings, that is, low-pass or high-pass settings, differ from the regular EQ shelf settings in that when they're set to a default value, they still perform some kind of change on the audio, even if it isn't that noticeable. For instance, if we have our high-pass frequency set to the lowest possible frequency, to the ear it's going to sound like all frequencies are being let through. However, right down at the frequencies that are at the very bottom of our hearing range, there will still be a boost caused by some resonance down there, followed by a sharp drop-off. Though you might not notice anything unusual while you're working on your mashup, these low-frequency boosts will actually cause the limiter on the master track to think that there's a huge amount of volume suddenly coming through and squash down the volume of the whole mashup. It can also have devastating effects when you play the track out live, because each nightclub's PA system is set up a little differently, and some will have limiters over them that kick in quite aggressively when the bottom-end frequencies start to get out of control. This means the volume of your current track can drop suddenly, causing a dramatic loss of energy on the dance floor. The great thing about having a high-pass filter set up on every track is that you can easily duplicate it and create a low-pass filter if you need to. Simply duplicate it over and change the setting to a low-pass filter. Then you can do whatever you want with it. Just like when the filter is being used as a high pass, make sure you keep it switched off when you're not using it, because even when it's all the way open, frequencies right at the very top of our hearing range will be boosted. The effect is subtle, but the high frequencies are actually quite harsh and fatiguing to the ear. Now that we have the two devices set up on our audio track, look at the audio track settings and just double check that the track volume is set at its default value, 0 dB, meaning that there'll be no change to the audio as it passes through it, and that the pan setting is also set at center, so that the track is sending an equal amount of audio to the left and right channels. Next, we're going to duplicate the track. Don't forget to delete any audio or automation you've written on the track. Set up the track exactly as you want every track in your template to be. For me personally, that means setting the automation to look at the track volume, and a single EQ and filter on each track. Now, highlight the track and duplicate it a bunch of times using Ctrl-D on Windows or Command-D on Mac. Duplicate the track as many times as you think you'll need. I'd suggest around 10 to start with. It doesn't always mean you'll use all 10 tracks. In fact, 10 tracks is quite a lot. But it's nice to have some extra space on your arrangement page so that there's somewhere to drag extra loops and ideas that you want to chop up. While working on mashups, if you start to find that you're running out of tracks, just jump back over to your template session and add a few more tracks. Now that we have a few audio tracks ready, it's time to set up a few dedicated return tracks. As explained in the last video, return tracks are a great place to send little bits of audio off to when you want to create a specific effect like delay or reverb. Depending on the template that your new session comes from, you may already have a couple of return tracks set up. If so, just select them and delete them. To start with, I'd suggest creating 3 return tracks, although it does depend what version of Ableton Live you're using. If you're using Live Standard, you can only create 2 return tracks, in which case I'd have a think about what kind of returns are going to be the most valuable for you and create those. Your first return will be a delay effect. A delay is an effect which simply receives an audio signal, holds onto it for a predetermined amount of time, and then outputs it. When we send some music there, it's going to sound like a second version of it is playing just behind the first. Some people call this echo. In a psychoacoustic sense, it creates a sense of space by making it feel like the music we hear is bouncing off a surface somewhere and coming back to us. In mashups, you'll usually be using delay as a blending effect. It will allow you to cut out tracks very suddenly while letting some of the feeling of them carry over into the next section. Let's set one up now. Go up to Live's devices and drag the ping pong delay down onto the return track. Place some audio on one of your audio tracks. Make it something simple so that you can easily hear what the delay is doing. In this example, we've picked a percussion sound and placed it on every beat for a whole bar. Then we loop that bar so that we continuously hear it play back. To send some of the audio to the return track, use the send control next to the volume control. You can also do this with automation under the Mixer tab. The longer the delay between the direct audio and the delayed audio, the larger the space. The great thing about a delay is that you can set a delay time that matches some significant rhythmical timing, causing an effect that not only creates a sense of space, but is actually in rhythm with the track. You can do this by using sync mode instead of time mode. The boxes labelled 1 through to 16 signify steps, which are another name for sixteenths, that is, 16ths of a bar. Select 4 to make it one full beat which locks to your session tempo. For any effect you place on a return track, it's very important to make sure that you set the wet-dry level to 100% wet. The dry signal is the original audio, whereas the wet signal is the completely affected signal only, which in this case is our delayed version of the track. This is very important. If any dry signal is allowed to come back, it's going to make it feel like the entire track is louder, because there'll be a second version of the original playing over the top of itself. Set the feedback to around 50 to 60%. Set your delay to sync with the session tempo, and set the delay interval to 4 steps, or 1 beat. 1 beat isn't always the magic delay time, but it's a good one to start with because you can be reasonably sure that as far as rhythm goes, it's going to be a significant interval. Plus, it's an interval that's not going to create any problems over music that's swung or music that's in triplet time. Set up the next return track as a reverb send. This effect will be 100% psychoacoustic. If you're not familiar with what reverb is, it's the phenomenon where a sound occurs in a space and sound is reflected off various surfaces in the room, arriving at our ears after the direct sound does. This tells our brain what kind of space the sound was created in. It's a good idea to have a listen to the kind of music you work with primarily, and have a listen to some of the most important elements, such as the vocals. See if you can figure out what kind of space it sounds like it's been recorded in. Then you can choose a reverb that has a similar characteristic and use that on your return track. You'll be using this reverb to help blend elements together and make them feel like they belong in the same space. The live device reverb will do just fine for this. Drag in the Hall preset from the reverb submenu in the audio effects list. Alter the decay time, pre-delay and size using your ears to compare and match a genre that is fairly standard for you. Again, don't forget to switch your reverb to 100% wet. If you work in more epic, floaty, psychedelic genres like trance, you'll find that a big, long reverb is more suitable, such as a plate reverb or a hall reverb with a decay time of something like 3 to 5 seconds. If your genre is something smaller and tighter, like backroom house or electro, you might find that a medium-sized room with a decay of around 2 seconds will fit in better. Play around with a few presets until you find something that sounds close. After you've picked a reverb, make sure the frequencies under around 600 Hz are cut off. You do want the reverb to help blend an element into the rest of the music, but you don't want to do it at the cost of dance music's most important elements, the kick and the bass. If the reverb itself has a low cut setting, then by all means use it. If not, simply place another EQ after the reverb and do the same thing, remembering that the audio in the return travels from left to right on the device chain. Use a filter with a low Q or resonance, as we don't want to draw any attention to the frequency cutoff point, we just subtly want to clean it up. If you have another return track available to you, this is the chance to create a really massive reverb. This is something to be used only at special moments to enhance transitions and to help hide edits. Simply repeat the process that you used for your previous return, dragging a reverb plugin onto the return track, only this time set your decay time to something massive, like 12 to 15 seconds. This may seem excessive, but often you need the reverb to carry audibly on through 4 or more bars. For instance, if you're dropping to silence and you need something to carry across the space. If possible, use a plate reverb. The purpose of this reverb is to intentionally conceal and hide the audio underneath it, as the plugin floods the song with sound. Its long reverb tail hides edits from the listener by reducing the intelligibility of the dry sound. Still, it's good to use another low cut on it to make sure that the bottom end frequencies aren't completely destroyed. And again, set your reverb to 100% wet. After you've set up your 3 returns, if you haven't done so already, name your return tracks by right-clicking the return track's title and clicking Rename. Give them a name that's meaningful to you, like Delay Sand, Plate Verb, or Huge Verb. Before we go any further, let's just hit save. That's Ctrl-S on Windows or Command-S on Mac. Now let's look at the master track. As discussed in the last video, the master track performs 2 important roles. Firstly, it's the destination for all of our audio to end up. And secondly, it's the location for all of our global song automation. Let's look at the automation first. On the master channel, select the mixer drop-down and click on Song Tempo. As well as displaying a lane for you to automate the session tempo, you'll notice Live gives you a minimum and maximum range for this value. Live can handle tempos from 20 BPM all the way up to 999 BPM. But as you can imagine, if the automation lane stretched all the way between these 2 values, it would be impossible to work with. To make it easier for you, they let you set a minimum and a maximum value so that you can work within that scope. Go ahead and set them to something that makes sense within your genre. For instance, if you work with slower types of house music, you might find that you never get above around 128 BPM. So it might be worth setting the maximum tempo to 128. However, you might sometimes work in styles like trance that can get up to 150 BPM. In that case, you'll probably want to set your maximum to around 150. The best way to figure out what kind of tempos you're going to be working with is to just import a bunch of tracks that are typical for what you'd be working on and find out what tempo they are. Then you can set your minimum and maximum with a few BPM either side just for safety. Finally, just set the song tempo to something in between the minimum and maximum. It doesn't really matter for now, as this is a setting that will have to change depending on each situation. Next, it's time to talk about controlling those audio signals coming in. If you've read the section in the book about audio theory, then you'll understand that each track coming into the master is likely already mastered so that its peak levels reach around 0 dB full scale. If we consider the way that digital audio works, we already know that 2 or more audio signals coming in will be summed together to create an even louder signal, wherein many of the samples could actually come out louder than the maximum amplitude allowed in a pulse code modulation signal. In our mashup, multiple audio tracks and return tracks will all be outputting their audio signals straight into the master channel, meaning that when the master track adds them together and eventually renders them into a WAV or MP3, it'll be unable to place some samples at their correct amplitude, and we'll end up with distorted or clipped audio. Traditionally, 0 decibels full scale was the absolute loudest level you were allowed to go to within a digital audio workstation. Even these days, if you're producing or mixing a track, having each element peak around 0 dB is still pretty much unforgivable. However, Ableton have designed this software to be used by DJs dealing with pieces of music that are mastered to their absolute limit, so they've built in a few safeguards to make sure that we don't run into problems. This is another reason why the software is perfect for mashups, because if you think about it, mashups are generally dealing with fully mastered music already. In between each channel, between each device, and even between any channel and the master channel, there's quite a lot of headroom there to make sure that the signal stays intact after signal processing, summing, or volume changes. This helps users out by making sure that if they accidentally work with levels that are too loud, they won't be faced with clipped audio. Even though the samples technically overshoot 0 dB, they'll be preserved all the way through the signal path, all the way up to a whopping value of 62 decibels full scale. That said, you should be aware that not all third-party plugins allow you that kind of headroom, and that you should be sensible when working with audio. Many plugins won't even tell you if they're chopping samples off the top. While this headroom is really handy, at the very end of the device chain on the master channel, Live has to save all the audio information into a format that's widely recognized. At this point, if there are any samples that are overshooting 0 dB, they'll be rounded to 0 dB, causing clipping. Therefore, it's important to make sure we set up a limiter as the last device on our chain and make sure that all the audio is behaving itself before it gets rendered. We also want it set up so that if the audio is under 0 dB in loudness, that it will come through the master channel unaffected. This is really important because a lot of the time we'll simply be playing a track that's already finished and mastered, and there's no need for extra limiting. So let's set it up now. Begin by setting up a utility. Utility is a device that you can find under Audio Effects. Leave its settings to the default value, but click the activator switch on the device to bypass it for now. Most of the time, you won't need this device, but if things get a little too loud or start cracking up when more than one element is playing, you can use the utility device to pull the entire mashup's volume back a little before it goes into the next and final device, which is the limiter. This can reduce the amount of pressure that we have to put on the limiter itself. The limiter is basically a safety net to catch all of the unexpected peaks in an audio signal. If you're familiar with a compressor, it acts the same, only it doesn't allow any signal to pop out above a specified threshold. In mastering, that means that the resulting signal can be boosted to reach all the way to 0 decibels full scale, making full use of the PCM amplitude resolution and making the music as loud as other commercially available music. For our purposes, it means that the audio signal after the limiter is safe to be written into a WAV file. You can use Live's limiter, but you'll find a lot of the time that you have to pull your utility volume back quite a bit to avoid any distortion at the limiter stage. If you have a great quality limiter like Waves L2, that's even better. It's very important that you use a limiter that will leave everything under its ceiling or threshold completely untouched if possible. Limiters with a brick wall setting are what you're looking for. Some limiters work with advanced modes that begin to squash the audio as it approaches the ceiling rather than actually waiting until the volume hits the ceiling first. This kind of limiter is quite musical and very useful when mastering some types of track, but it's not good for mashups. It will push the dynamics around even if there's only one track playing through it, whereas we don't actually want to start limiting the audio until we have to. If you don't have any third-party limiters, try using the free-to-download plugin Limiter Number 6 by Vladg Sound. It does a good job of keeping things under control without sacrificing too much volume. Check out the description for a link to the plugin. If using Limiter Number 6, make the following changes to the factory default preset to make it nice and transparent. In the compressor section, turn the compressor from norm to off position. And in the peak limiter section, turn the gain to -1 and the type to A. These settings will do fine for limiter number 6. If you're using a brick wall limiter like the Waves L2, set your ceiling value to -0.2 dB and leave the gain setting at 0 dB. Stick with an auto release time if your limiter has one, otherwise set it to a nice long time of around 1 second. Test it out by playing a regular piece of dance music through it. If you switch the limiter on or off, you shouldn't really be able to hear any audible difference. When working on mashups later on, the limiter will protect any samples from actually overshooting 0 dB, but if there's too much volume coming in, the limiter can still make a mess of the audio. There's a couple of things you can do in this situation. Sometimes the main track that you're using will have been mastered so loudly that there's just no room for anything else. As soon as you bring in another element, everything just starts to break up. In this situation, it's usually best to just bring that main track down a little bit, either by bringing all the track's volume automation points down, or by selecting all of the audio clips that represent that main track and turning the clip volume down. If you feel like the balance between the elements is right as it is, and you'd rather just turn the entire mashup down a little bit, your second option is to leave the session as is and simply bring the volume of everything down at once by activating the utility plugin on the master channel and bringing the gain of that down by 1 to 2 dB. This way, the combined signal level is not as loud once it reaches the limiter. You'll lose a little overall volume, but it's a lot better than having a distorted mashup. So your template's now complete. Don't forget to get rid of any audio, automation, or settings on the tracks. Hit save one more time. Now, if you're going to be using your template all the time and you don't use Ableton Live for music production, I'd suggest also making this template your default session. You can do this by going to Options, Preferences, go to the File Folder tab, down to the Save Current Set as Default setting, and click Save. One more thing to think about with templates. The whole point of this is to make sure that you never waste time setting up the same device, the same automation lane, or the same return channel every single time you make a mashup. If you find that you commonly do anything that can be saved into your template, by all means add it in. Even if there's a selection of audio samples you find you use all the time, you may want to just place them muted on a spare track somewhere where you can easily activate it and drag it where you want. You could even keep an audio track at the end of your session just for storing devices that you use all the time, like a low-pass filter, frequency shifters, or other effects. This is how you can get really efficient at making big batches of mashups really quickly. In the next video, we'll be looking at the basics of mashup arrangement. Thanks for watching.